There's something deeply unsettling about being misunderstood in a very specific way. When people reduce you to something harmless, something soft, something predictable, they look at your restraint and call it innocence. They look at your patience and call it weakness. They look at your silence and assume there's nothing behind it. And so they give you a label that feels almost flattering on the surface, but is, in fact, a profound miscalculation, because what they fail to recognize is that what appears as light is often forged in confrontation with darkness, that what looks like calm is frequently the result of chaos that has already been faced, endured, and brought under voluntary control. You don't become good by accident. You don't become disciplined, measured, and precise without first encountering the very forces that could have made you dangerous in a far less controlled way. And that's where the tension lies. Because the same person they call an angel is someone who has looked directly at what frightens others. Impulses, aggression, the capacity for destruction, and instead of being consumed by it, has integrated it. Not eliminated it, not denied it, integrated it. And that's a very different thing. Because something integrated doesn't disappear. It waits. It listens. It obeys. So when they stand there, comfortably placing you into a category that makes them feel safe, they're not seeing the full picture. They're seeing the surface, level order, but not the underlying structure that makes that order possible. And the truth is, order without the capacity for chaos isn't virtue. It's fragility. It's naivete. What actually commands respect, what actually alters the way the world responds to you, is the quiet recognition that beneath your composure lies something formidable, something that could act, could disrupt, could push back, but chooses not to, except when it becomes absolutely necessary. And that's precisely why your presence unsettles certain people in ways they can't quite articulate. Because on some level, they can sense that what you've built within yourself is not just goodness. It's controlled power. It's the ability to navigate darkness without becoming it. And for those who rely on manipulation, on chaos, on exploiting weakness, that's a problem. To be perceived as harmless is, in many cases, less an accurate assessment of your character and more a reflection of the observer's limitations. Limitations in perception, in experience, and, perhaps most importantly, in their willingness to confront complexity. People have a tendency to simplify what they do not immediately understand. It's cognitively efficient. It allows them to move through the world without constantly reassessing every individual they encounter. But that efficiency comes at a cost, because when they look at you and conclude that you are harmless, what they are often doing is compressing a multi-layered personality into something flat, something digestible, something that doesn't require deeper engagement. And that compression is not neutral. It reveals something about them. It suggests that they equate quietness with weakness, restraint with incapacity, and composure with passivity. These are not trivial assumptions. They are rooted in a worldview that prioritizes what is immediately visible and dismisses what is latent, what is potential, what is deliberately held back. So when you don't react impulsively, when you don't assert dominance in obvious or aggressive ways, they interpret that absence of display as an absence of ability. But that's a categorical error, because the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly when what is absent is something consciously withheld. There is also a subtle psychological comfort in labeling someone as harmless. It reduces uncertainty. If you are harmless, then you are predictable. If you are predictable, then you are manageable. And if you are manageable, then you pose no threat to the existing structure of their world. Socially, psychologically, even hierarchically. That's reassuring, especially for individuals who rely on stability in their assumptions about others. But that reassurance is fragile, because it is built on an incomplete model of who you are. What complicates this further is that genuinely capable individuals often do not feel the need to advertise their capability. In fact, there is a strong argument to be made that the more integrated and disciplined a person becomes, the less overtly they display their strength. Not because they lack it, but because they are not governed by the impulse to prove it. They understand the cost of unnecessary conflict. They recognize that power, when exercised indiscriminately, leads to chaos rather than order. So they choose restraint, not as a default born of weakness, but as a strategic decision grounded in awareness. And that's precisely where the misinterpretation becomes most pronounced. Because from the outside, restraint and incapacity can look remarkably similar. Both involve a lack of visible action. Both can appear as silence, as stillness, as non-engagement, but internally, they are radically different states. Incapacity is characterized by an absence of options. Restraint, on the other hand, is defined by the presence of options and the deliberate choice not to act on them. So when someone calls you harmless, what they may actually be revealing is that they have neither the perceptual acuity nor the experiential depth to distinguish between those two states. They are not seeing the tension you carry, the discipline you've cultivated, or the boundaries you've chosen to uphold. They are seeing a simplified version of you that fits neatly within their existing framework. And there's a certain danger in that, not necessarily for you, but for them. Because underestimating someone who has both the capacity for action and the discipline to regulate it is a mistake that tends to correct itself abruptly. Not because such a person is seeking to prove anything, but because reality has a way of asserting itself when pushed beyond a certain threshold. And when that happens, the discrepancy between perception and actuality becomes impossible to ignore. There is a pervasive and, in many ways, dangerously simplistic assumption that virtue is synonymous with the absence of darkness, that to be good is to be free of aggressive impulses, free of resentment, free of the capacity to harm. It's an appealing idea, particularly because it offers a clean, almost sanitized image of morality. But it collapses under even a modest degree of scrutiny, because it ignores a fundamental aspect of human nature, the undeniable presence of potential for destruction within every individual. To deny that capacity is not to eliminate it. It is to render yourself unconscious of it. And what remains unconscious does not disappear. It operates in ways that are indirect, uncontrolled, and often far more damaging precisely because it is not acknowledged. So the person who insists that they are entirely free of darkness is not virtuous. They are naive, or worse, they are blind to the very forces that can govern their behavior under pressure. Real virtue emerges from a far more difficult process. It requires that you first recognize, in a very honest and unflinching manner, that you are capable of actions that are not only undesirable, but potentially catastrophic. That you have within you the same structures that, under different circumstances, could manifest as cruelty, manipulation, or even outright destruction. This is not a comfortable realization. It destabilizes the image you might prefer to have of yourself. But it is also the necessary starting point for any genuine moral development. Because once that recognition is established, the question becomes, what do you do with it? And this is where the distinction between suppression and integration becomes critical. Suppression is an attempt to push those darker elements out of conscious awareness, to deny them, to reject them, to pretend they are not part of you. But that strategy is inherently unstable. What is suppressed tends to re-emerge, often in distorted and exaggerated forms, precisely because it has not been given structure or direction. Integration, by contrast, is a process of bringing those elements into conscious alignment with your values. It is the deliberate act of understanding your capacity for aggression, for example, and then learning how to channel it in ways that are productive rather than destructive. It is recognizing that the same force that could be used to harm can also be used to defend, to assert boundaries, to confront injustice. But that transformation does not happen automatically. It requires discipline. It requires self-awareness. It requires a willingness to take responsibility for what you are capable of, rather than disowning it. And this is where true virtue begins to take shape, not in the absence of power, but in the regulation of it. Not in being incapable of doing harm, but in choosing, consistently and consciously, not to act on that capacity, except when it is justified and necessary. That choice carries weight, because it is made in the presence of genuine alternatives. It is not the default behavior of someone who lacks options. It is the deliberate stance of someone who has them. There is also a certain strength in this kind of integration that is immediately recognizable, even if it is not always consciously articulated. People can sense when someone has confronted their own darkness and brought it under control. There is a stability there, a kind of groundedness that does not rely on external validation. It is not performative. It does not need to announce itself, and that, paradoxically, makes it far more compelling than any superficial display of goodness. Because superficial goodness is brittle. It depends on circumstances remaining favorable. It depends on not being tested beyond a certain point. But integrated virtue is resilient. It has already accounted for the possibility of failure, of conflict, of pressure. It has already engaged with the internal forces that might otherwise lead to collapse. And as a result, it does not fracture as easily when those forces are encountered in the external world. There is a strong and deeply ingrained tendency to treat the darker aspects of one's personality as something alien, something intrusive that must be rejected outright, as if it were an external contaminant rather than an intrinsic component of the psyche. People often speak about their anger, their aggression, their capacity for resentment as though these elements are entirely separate from who they really are. And in doing so, they create a kind of internal division that is not only inaccurate, but also profoundly destabilizing. Because the reality is that your shadow, those traits you would rather not identify with, is not an optional add onto your personality. It is part of the total structure. It contains within it a significant portion of your potential energy, your assertiveness, your ability to confront, to resist, to push back against what is unjust or misaligned. And when you reject it completely, when you attempt to disown it, what you are effectively doing is severing yourself from a critical source of strength. Now, that doesn't mean the shadow should be expressed impulsively or without constraint. That's precisely the mistake that leads to destructive behavior. But the opposite mistake, pretending it doesn't exist, is equally problematic. Because what is denied does not vanish. It becomes autonomous. It operates outside the domain of conscious control. And in that state, it is far more likely to manifest in ways that are disproportionate, misdirected, or even harmful to the very structures you are trying to maintain. So the task is not elimination. The task is understanding. It is the careful and often uncomfortable process of examining those aspects of yourself that you would prefer to ignore. Why do you feel anger in certain situations? What triggers your impulse to dominate or withdraw? Where does your resentment originate? And what does it reveal about your unmet expectations or violated boundaries? These are not trivial questions, and they do not have simple answers. But engaging with them is what allows you to begin transforming raw, unrefined impulses into something structured and usable. Because within that shadow lies the capacity for decisive action. It is the part of you that refuses to tolerate being treated unfairly. It is the source of the energy required to set boundaries, to say no when necessary, to confront rather than avoid. Without access to that energy, you become overly compliant, excessively agreeable, and ultimately vulnerable to exploitation. You may appear virtuous on the surface, but that virtue is hollow if it is maintained at the cost of your ability to protect yourself and assert your position in the world. And this is where discipline enters the equation. Because integrating the shadow is not about giving it free rein. It is about subjecting it to a higher order of organization. It is about taking that raw potential and aligning it with your values, your goals, your long-term orientation. That requires a level of self-regulation that is neither automatic nor easy. It demands that you remain aware of your impulses without being governed by them, that you acknowledge their presence without allowing them to dictate your behavior. There is also a certain paradox in this process. The more familiar you become with your capacity for darkness, the less likely you are to be controlled by it. Not because it disappears, but because it is no longer unknown. It no longer operates in the shadows, so to speak. It becomes something you can anticipate, something you can prepare for, something you can direct. And in that state, it shifts from being a liability to being an asset. This transformation does not make you dangerous in the chaotic sense. It makes you formidable in a controlled and deliberate way. It means that when a situation calls for strength, for confrontation, for resistance, you are not left scrambling to access resources you have never developed. They are already there, integrated into your behavioral repertoire, ready to be deployed with precision rather than impulse. And that's a fundamentally different mode of being from the one that relies on avoidance and denial. It is grounded in the recognition that strength is not the absence of darker tendencies, but the ability to harness them without being overwhelmed by them. It is the capacity to stand firmly in situations that would otherwise provoke either collapse or uncontrolled reaction, and to respond in a way that is both effective and aligned with who you have chosen to become. Human beings are, to a remarkable degree, oriented toward predictability. It's not merely a preference. It's a psychological necessity. Predictability allows for the construction of stable expectations, and those expectations form the basis upon which we navigate social reality. When you can anticipate how someone will respond, how they will behave under pressure, how they will interpret events, you can position yourself accordingly. You can negotiate, cooperate, even compete without constantly recalibrating your understanding of the situation. But when that predictability is disrupted, something far more primitive begins to emerge. Because what people find unsettling is not simply power or even aggression. It is the inability to map someone accurately. And that's precisely what happens when calm is paired with capability. When an individual presents themselves in a composed, measured, and controlled manner, but simultaneously carries an underlying sense of strength that is not immediately expressed, it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance in the observer. The signals don't align with their expectations. The behavior doesn't fit neatly into a predefined category. Most people rely on surface, level cues to assess others. Tone of voice, posture, willingness to interrupt, displays of dominance. These are the markers that are typically used to determine who is assertive, who is passive, who is likely to push back, and who is likely to yield. But when someone does not conform to those visible patterns, when they do not engage in overt displays of dominance, yet do not exhibit signs of submission either, the usual interpretive framework begins to break down. And it's in that breakdown that discomfort arises. Because now the observer is faced with uncertainty. They cannot easily determine your limits. They cannot predict your reactions with the same level of confidence. And in social dynamics, uncertainty often translates into perceived risk. Not necessarily because you are behaving in a threatening manner, but because you are not behaving in a way that can be easily categorized or anticipated. There is also a deeper layer to this, one that operates beneath conscious awareness. People are constantly, and often unconsciously, testing boundaries. They make small moves, subtle provocations, minor encroachments, slight shifts in tone, to gauge how others will respond. These tests are not always malicious. They are part of the ongoing negotiation of social hierarchy and personal space. But they rely heavily on predictability. If they know how you will respond, they can adjust their behavior to either accommodate or exploit that response. However, when your demeanor remains calm, but your responses are measured and precise rather than automatic, those tests yield ambiguous results. Sometimes you allow, sometimes you resist, but always in a way that appears deliberate rather than reactive. And that inconsistency, though it is not actually inconsistency, but rather context-sensitive behavior, makes it difficult for others to establish a stable model of your behavior. That difficulty can be interpreted as unease. Because if someone cannot predict you, they cannot easily control or influence you. And if they cannot do that, then the usual strategies they rely on, whether cooperative or manipulative, become less effective. So what they experience is not necessarily fear in the conventional sense, but a kind of psychological tension, a recognition that there is more going on beneath the surface than is being explicitly displayed. It's also worth noting that this kind of presence does not require overt assertion to be impactful. In fact, its strength lies precisely in its subtlety. When calm is genuine, when it is not a facade, but the result of internal organization and self-regulation, it carries a certain weight. It signals that the individual is not easily destabilized, not easily provoked into losing control. And that in itself is a form of power that does not need to be advertised. Because what is truly unsettling is not loudness or aggression. Those are, in many ways, easier to interpret and respond to. What unsettles people is the quiet indication that someone has access to a wider range of responses than they are currently choosing to display. That there is a depth of capability that remains, for the most part, concealed but undeniably present